Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Movie theaters are meant to be an escape. Dim lights, a big screen, and a room full of strangers. But when the film starts to flicker and someone sits down beside you in an empty row, the illusion breaks. I arrived at the theater earlier than I usually would, sometime before 10:30 that night. Midnight premieres had always drawn crowds, but this one felt different. The Dark Knight Rises wasn't just another summer movie. It was the conclusion to something people had been following for years. The anticipation surrounding it made the entire evening feel like an event, something shared and meaningful. I had planned to meet a couple of friends, but they had canceled last minute, and I decided to go alone rather than miss the opening night. The lobby was filled with noise, a constant hum of conversation layered over the background music and the flicker of trailers playing on wall-mounted screens. People moved around with bags of popcorn and oversized drinks, and there were more than a few fans in costume. I passed a group near the ticket counter dressed as various characters from the franchise. Batman, Catwoman, even a few people in Joker makeup. It didn't feel strange to me. Midnight premieres always brought out the dedicated ones, the fans who wanted to turn it into something special. After getting my ticket scanned, I stepped inside the auditorium and made my way toward the back rows. I had always preferred sitting closer to the rear, not just because it gave a better view of the entire screen, but also because I liked this sense of distance from the crowd. I chose a seat about 3 rows from the back on the far left, near the aisle. The theater was already beginning to fill up, and by the time the preview started, nearly every seat was taken. There was a loud cheer when the first official trailer ended. People laughed and shouted back at the screen. There was an energy in the room that felt infectious, something that reminded me of why I loved being in theaters in the first place. It felt safe, comfortable, like everyone in that room shared a moment of joy before the film began. I didn't know, as I sat there sipping my drink, that I would soon be watching people I had smiled at in the lobby die in front of me, roughly 20 minutes into the movie. While the film was building into its first big action sequence, I noticed a sudden change in the environment that had nothing to do with what was happening on screen. There was a small movement near the emergency exit toward the lower right corner of the auditorium. The door opened slightly, and a thin strip of white hallway light spilled into the room. I barely registered it at first. I assumed someone had stepped out earlier and was quietly slipping back in. The door closed again behind them, and the movie continued. Not long after that, a strange sound filled the space. A sharp hiss, as though pressurized gas had been released. A thick, acrid-smelling smoke began to spread from the front of the theater. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of effect tied to the movie, perhaps part of an elaborate stunt or promotional surprise the theater had arranged. A few people coughed. Some started shifting in their seats, unsure of what they were experiencing. The smoke wasn't thick at that point, but it made breathing uncomfortable. My eyes began to sting. Then I heard a sound I couldn't mistake. The distinct, brutal crack of a firearm being discharged inside an enclosed space. It echoed through the room with a force that no movie could replicate. The confusion was immediate and complete. People hesitated, looking around as if trying to identify where the sound had come from. unsure whether it was real or something from the film itself. The gunfire had seemed to align with what was happening on screen. And for a few terrifying seconds, the two blended into something surreal and paralyzing. But the illusion broke quickly. Someone screamed in genuine terror, a raw, piercing sound that had nothing to do with the film. A figure in the front of the room had begun firing indiscriminately into the audience. He was wearing black tactical gear and a gas mask that covered his entire face. From where I was sitting, I could only see the upper portion of his body at first, but it was clear that he was holding more than one weapon. He moved calmly, without hesitation or fear, stepping between the rows of seats and firing into them without any visible emotion. The entire theater erupted into chaos. Some people tried to run toward the exits, only to find that the aisles were already blocked with bodies and panicked groups trying to climb over one another. Others remained frozen in their seats, as if hoping that staying still would keep them from being noticed. I dropped down immediately behind the seat in front of me and pulled my knees tightly against my chest, trying to keep myself low and out of sight. My heartbeat was pounding so violently that I could feel it in my ears. The gunfire was deafening and relentless. Each shot echoed off the walls and ceilings in a way that made it impossible to tell where the bullets were landing. It felt like the entire room was shaking with each round fired. I remember watching a man fall forward over the seat in front of him, his arms hanging limply toward the floor. The woman beside him grabbed his arm and tried to pull him back, but he didn't move again. I couldn't tell whether she was speaking or crying. The noise drowned out everything else. From my position, I could see the shooter moving slowly up the center aisle. His pace never changed. He wasn't shouting or reacting to the panic around him. There was no sense of urgency in his body language, only a cold, methodical purpose. Every few steps, he would stop and fire again, directing the weapon into different sections of the audience. People tried to shield others with their bodies. I saw someone crawl over the backs of seats, dragging a smaller person behind them. Others were climbing under chairs or pressing their faces into the floor. I didn't move. I could barely breathe through the smoke, and my body had gone stiff with fear. At one point, the shooter passed close enough that I could see the curve of his helmet above the row in front of me. I held my breath and stared at the ground, afraid that any motion would draw his attention. The only thing I could hear over the gunfire was the fire alarm that had started blaring overhead, its high-pitched whine piercing through the smoke and chaos. Red strobe lights began to flash across the walls, adding to the disorientation. The movie continued to play on the screen throughout all of it. Eventually, the gunfire stopped. The silence that followed didn't feel like safety. It felt like the moment between two waves of destruction. No one moved. No one spoke. The air was still thick with smoke, and the red lights continued to pulse. I couldn't tell if the shooter had left or was simply reloading. I remained crouched on the floor, waiting for anything. A voice, a command, another shot. But nothing came. It wasn't until I saw the faint glow of red and blue lights flickering through the smoke-stained glass of the emergency exits that I realized the police had arrived. The doors were forced open, and officers began entering with flashlights drawn and weapons raised. Their voices rang out over the sirens and the alarms, calling for everyone to remain where they were, to keep their hands visible. They didn't know who the shooter was, or if there might be more than one. They approached each section carefully, checking each person, stepping over the wounded and the dead. An officer finally reached me, and shined his flashlight directly into my eyes. I blinked and held up my hands without speaking. He asked if I could walk. I nodded, though it took me several seconds to get my legs working. As I stood, I looked around and saw the extent of what had happened. The theater floor was scattered with overturned drinks, dropped purses, and bodies. Some were lying motionless. Others were trying to sit up or reach for their phones. There was blood in the aisles, smeared along the floor where people had tried to crawl to safety. I saw shoes, glasses, backpacks, all left behind in the panic. Outside, the parking lot had become a triage zone. Police vehicles, ambulances, fire trucks, and news vans were everywhere. Flashing lights illuminated the shocked faces of survivors wrapped in silver blankets. Some were sitting silently on the curb. Others were sobbing, shaking, or calling loved ones. I stood near the entrance for what felt like hours, unable to fully process what I had just experienced. I couldn't remember my own phone number. I couldn't form full sentences when someone tried to speak to me. I had walked out, but I didn't feel like I had truly left. They told us later that 12 people had been killed. Over 70 more had been injured. Some were wounded by bullets. Others were hurt in the crush to escape. A few never even made it out of their seats. I didn't know their names at the time, but I remembered their faces. I remembered the sound of someone gasping for breath 2 rows ahead of me. I remembered the stillness of a girl I had passed in the lobby just an hour earlier, now lying face down on the floor. In the weeks and months after, I found it impossible to enter a movie theater. The thought of sitting in the dark, of not knowing who was behind me or what might happen when the lights went down, made my chest tighten. Even in restaurants or classrooms, I began positioning myself near exits and avoiding spaces that felt closed off. I never felt entirely at ease again in places that once felt normal. Some theaters changed their policies after that night. They installed silent alarms on emergency exits and hired more security staff, but for those of us who were there, no amount of new rules or procedures could undo what we had lived through. That night had reached into a space meant for joy, for escape, and it had twisted it into something unrecognizable. It didn't end when the police took him into custody. It didn't end when the sirens stopped. For many of us, it continued every time we walked into a public space, every time we heard a sudden loud noise, every time we caught a whiff of something burning, and were reminded of the smoke. That night never really became a memory. It remained something that lived just under the surface, waiting. I began working at the Cedar Lane Theater in Austin during the fall of 1999, mostly because I needed something that paid and didn't require too much of my time or energy. I was 19 and halfway through community college, and most days felt like I was just going through the motions. The theater wasn't the kind of place you noticed unless you already knew where it was. It sat quietly between a shuttered pharmacy and a dry cleaner with a broken neon sign that never fully lit up. And the entire block always looked like it belonged to some earlier time that no one had gotten around to fixing or updating. The marquee above the entrance leaned to one side, and half the letters were either missing or put up backwards. Even from a distance, the building gave off the impression that it had been forgotten a long time ago. The inside didn't feel much better. The scent of damp carpet and artificial butter filled the air. And it never seemed to go away, no matter how much cleaner we used on the floor. The red fabric on the theater walls had faded to a dull, rust-colored brown, and the light fixtures buzzed overhead, dim and unsteady. The concessions counter looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in years, and behind it the shelves of candy were covered in a fine, sticky dust that clung to your skin if you touched anything. Still, I didn't mind the place. It gave me something to do during the long, quiet evenings. And the other employees mostly kept to themselves. Everyone there had a kind of tired look about them, like they had all seen something that lingered behind their eyes, but had long since decided not to talk about it. There were only 3 screening rooms in the entire theater. Screen 1 was small, barely more than a converted storage room with a few rows of creaky seats. Screen 2 was the most used, with average seating and the only projector that didn't break down once a week. Then there was Screen 3, which sat at the end of a long hallway that always seemed a little too dark, no matter how many overhead lights were on. It was the largest room, but also the most avoided. Something about it felt wrong, in a way that no one ever seemed to want to explain. Staff often traded off duties just to avoid it. And I noticed that whenever Screen 3 was on the cleaning schedule, the person assigned to it worked quickly and never lingered longer than absolutely necessary. At first, I thought it was just another one of those irrational workplace things, like someone getting spooked by a rat once and then forever believing a certain closet was haunted. But the longer I worked there, the more I noticed the small behaviors that suggested it was something deeper. No one ever cleaned that screen alone unless they had no other option. No one entered without turning on the hallway lights first. No one ever walked all the way up the back steps during a final sweep unless someone else was already inside the room with them. After about 3 weeks of working there, I was sweeping behind the concessions counter when Rachel, one of the longer-serving employees, asked me casually whether I'd ever done a closing sweep of Screen 3. I told her I hadn't yet. She didn't follow up or say anything more after that. She just nodded to herself in this quiet, unreadable way, like the answer had confirmed something she already knew. I didn't think much of it at the time. She wasn't the type to make small talk, and I assumed her question was just a routine part of training the newer employees. It wasn't until my first solo close in Screen 3 that I began to understand what she had really meant. It happened in late October, during one of those cold evenings where the air outside had a damp stillness to it, and the parking lot lights seemed dimmer than usual. The final movie of the night had just ended, and I was the last one on shift. The other employees had clocked out, and I was left with the checklist of closing tasks that I had already half finished. I had saved Screen 3 for last without really thinking about it, figuring I would get it over with and be out of there in 10 minutes. When I stepped inside, the screen was still casting a faint glow from the film credits, though the sound had already been cut. The room was silent, except for the low mechanical whir of the ceiling fan. I switched on my flashlight and began the routine sweep down the center aisle, shining the beam between the rows of seats, looking for trash or anything left behind. Everything looked normal at first. Empty cups, crumpled napkins, a few half-eaten boxes of candy. But as I reached the top of the theater and turned toward the last row, I noticed something small caught beneath the seat closest to the far corner. I crouched down to get a better look and found what appeared to be an old ticket stub. The paper was worn thin, the edges curled and discolored, and the ink had faded in several places, but enough of it remained for me to make out the date. October 17th, 1992. I held it in my hand for a while, trying to figure out how something that old could still be floating around in a theater that got cleaned every night. It didn't make sense. Someone would have found it years ago if it had really been sitting there all that time. I slipped the stub into my jacket pocket and left the room without finishing the sweep. I didn't check the seat any further. I didn't shine the flashlight into the far corners. I just walked out, turned off the screen light, and moved quickly through the hallway, not stopping until I reached the office. The next day, I brought the ticket with me to work and showed it to Rachel before our shift started. She didn't laugh or accuse me of making it up. She didn't even seem surprised. She just took it from my hand, turned it over slowly, and stared at the date like it confirmed something she had already suspected for a long time. Then she handed it back and told me about the boy. She said it happened during a Saturday matinee in the fall of 1992. A family had come in to see a film, nothing unusual. And about halfway through the screening, their son, who was 9 years old, had asked to go to the bathroom. His name was Jason. He left his seat in the middle of the film and walked toward the lobby. That was the last time anyone saw him. When the movie ended and he didn't return, his parents went looking for him. Staff searched the restrooms, the lobby, the storage rooms, even the alley behind the building. The police were called. The building was shut down for a full investigation. But no trace of him was ever found. There was no indication that he had left the building, no sign of a struggle, nothing on any of the security tapes, although, as it turned out, most of the cameras had been broken that week and hadn't been repaired yet. The entire case remained open for years, but no suspect was ever identified, and his body was never recovered. The only confirmed detail was that Jason had last been seen walking toward screen 3. Over time, staff began reporting strange sightings during closing shifts. People would glance up toward the back of the theater and swear they had seen a child sitting alone in the farthest row. Always in the same seat, always dressed in outdated clothing. Descriptions that matched what Jason had been wearing the day he vanished. A windbreaker with faded stripes down the arms, high white socks, scuffed sneakers. Each time someone tried to approach him, the seat would be empty before they arrived. There were no sounds of footsteps, no doors opening or closing, just an empty cushion and the faint, lingering warmth that suggested someone had been sitting there moments earlier. These weren't just stories told by a single person. Over the years, several employees described the exact same details without knowing each other's accounts. Some of them quit after the first incident. Others stayed but avoided screen 3 as much as possible. No one joked about it. It wasn't treated like an urban legend or a harmless ghost tale. It was simply something that existed within the theater, quietly, persistently, and without explanation. After hearing all of that, I never looked at screen 3 the same way again. I avoided closing it unless absolutely necessary. And when I had to, I made sure the hallway lights were on before I went inside. I stopped using the flashlight alone and began bringing someone with me whenever I could. I never sat down in that last row. I never went near the seat where I found the ticket. And even if it was just my imagination, I always felt a subtle shift in the air when I passed that part of the theater, like the room had tensed slightly the moment I entered. I kept the ticket stub in my wallet for a long time. I didn't talk about it much, and eventually, after I left the job and moved on with my life, I stopped thinking about the theater as often. But every so often, when I walk past an old cinema or see an empty theater in a movie scene, I feel that same chill again. I remember the boy I never actually saw. I remember the row that never stayed empty for long. And I remember the rule that every employee followed, even if they never said it aloud. No one ever closed screen 3 by themselves, and no one ever went in without the lights on, I worked at the Regent Crest Theater during the fall of 2005. It was one of the last historic cinemas operating downtown. A once grand movie palace on Queen Street West, squeezed between coffee shops and apartment buildings. Though its Art Deco moldings and box-style marquee remained, much of its interior had been modernized. The digital transition was already well underway when I was hired. Most of the projection work was handled by updated systems, and the sounds of film reels and projectors had long faded into memory for the average guest. But the building itself carried its age. It creaked in quiet places, breathed through the vents, and always smelled faintly of dust and warm metal. I worked the evening shifts behind the concession counter and occasionally cleaned the auditoriums after the late screenings. I didn't know many of the older staff well, but I became familiar with the routines. Most of us were students or part-timers, coming in and out of the place like a revolving door. But there were a few people who had been part of the theater for what felt like forever. One of them was a man named Warren Fielding. Warren was in his late 50s and had been working at the Regent Crest for longer than anyone else. Most employees only saw him in passing, and even those brief interactions were quiet. He rarely made conversation, rarely looked anyone in the eye, and moved through the building like someone with a private routine that never changed. He wore the same style of clothing every shift: gray, buttoned shirts tucked neatly into dark slacks, his shoes polished but old. He carried a small shoulder bag, often slung tight against his side, and a ring of keys that hung low on his belt and jingled softly as he walked. He never used the main entrance like the rest of us. He had a key to a side door in the alley behind the theater. Every night, almost exactly at 6 p.m., he would enter quietly, make his way past the main floors, and disappear up a stairwell that had been closed to the public for years. The stairwell led to the original projection booth on the 3rd floor, a room that hadn't been officially in use since early 2004, when the switch to digital had been completed. That 3rd floor projection room had always intrigued me. It was hidden behind an old utility door, marked by a faded sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." The door was always locked, and no one I knew had ever been inside. Management told us it hadn't been wired for electricity in over a year, and most of the equipment inside had been decommissioned. But Warren still went up there every single night, without fail. He would climb the stairs alone and remain inside the room until well after the last movie ended. By the time the guests had left and the lobby lights were dimmed, he would exit the building through the same alley door and disappear into the night. Most of us assumed he was simply maintaining the old machines, either as part of a contract or because no one had officially removed him from the payroll. It didn't seem to matter. His presence was familiar, even if distant. He was as much a part of the building as the wallpaper or the brittle old balcony seats that no one used anymore. Then, in mid-October, Warren stopped coming in. It was a quiet absence. His presence had never been loud or noticeable. So when he didn't show up one evening, no one reacted immediately. After 3 or 4 days, someone finally mentioned it to a supervisor. One of the assistant managers made a half-hearted attempt to call the number listed in his file, but the line had already been disconnected. The general feeling was that he had probably retired or moved on. He had been working alone in a room that no longer served a function, and there was no indication that he planned to return. A few of us commented on it briefly, but nothing official was said. His name remained on the schedule for a little while longer, and then it disappeared. By the 2nd week of his absence, something changed in the building. A strange smell began to rise through the upper corridors. At first, it was barely noticeable. Just a sour note in the air that drifted near the stairwell to the old projection booth. Some staff assumed it was mold, or perhaps something rotting in the ventilation system. But the smell grew stronger each day. It developed a sickly, sweet quality, sharp and lingering. It clung to the fabric of our uniforms, to the curtains near the balcony, and to the old wooden railings by the stairwell. I began to dread taking the upper-level walkthroughs at closing time, because the air near the locked door made my stomach turn. Maintenance was called in to check for dead rodents or water leaks. They searched the ducts and closets, but found nothing unusual. The smell persisted, and eventually, someone suggested that the third-floor projection room needed to be checked. Since Warren had always locked the door behind him, no one had entered it in weeks. When the maintenance crew finally opened the door, they had to call a locksmith because it was locked from the inside. It took nearly an hour to force it open. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard the janitor who was on shift that night became physically ill the moment the door swung open. The smell that came from the room was overwhelming, heavy, putrid, and unmistakable. It filled the corridor and poured down the stairwell into the second floor like smoke. Staff members were told to evacuate the upper levels while paramedics and a coroner were called. Warren had died alone in the projection booth. His body was found near the back wall, slumped beside a metal cabinet that had once held reels of film. One of his arms was extended toward a stack of canisters on the floor. His glasses were still on his face, and his body showed advanced signs of decomposition. The coroner determined he had likely suffered a heart attack and died on or around October 13th. His body had remained there for nearly 2 weeks. What disturbed me more than the discovery was what I remembered from the days leading up to it. During that week, I had noticed a strange sound on 2 separate nights. While closing one of the upper auditoriums, I walked past the second-floor landing and paused when I heard a low mechanical noise coming from the stairwell above. It sounded like film reels spinning. That soft, rhythmic whir I hadn't heard in over a year. I stood there for several seconds, trying to place it, but it stopped suddenly before I could be certain. I told myself it was probably the air system, though it didn't resemble any fan or vent I'd encountered before. Another night, I glanced up at the small, rectangular window above the old stairwell door and saw a flicker of light. It was faint and pulsing, like the beam of an active projector. Steady and white, not the harsh glare of a utility bulb. The third-floor booth was supposed to be disconnected from power. There had been no working lights or electricity in that space since the previous year. And yet, the glow had been there, just for a moment, before vanishing. Other employees mentioned similar experiences. A few claimed to hear clicking noises late at night, as if film reels were being threaded through machines. Someone else swore she had seen the light as well. Not once, but on 3 separate nights. Each time she looked again, it was gone. These were things we had brushed off at the time, explained away as quirks of an old building, but after Warren's body was found, the details took on a different weight. Once the authorities removed his body, management acted quickly. The projection booth was stripped of all equipment. The old projectors were dismantled, the shelves emptied, and everything inside the room was discarded. The interior was repainted, and the stairwell was locked and sealed permanently. No official announcement was made about Warren's death. Staff were not given any details beyond what we had already seen or heard. There was no mention of his years of service, no photo, no acknowledgement of his absence. Within a week, it was as if he had never worked there at all. I left the Regent Crest a few months later. The building itself closed permanently not long after that. From what I've heard, the upper floors have remained unused, and the third-floor booth has never been reopened. The alley door Warren once used has been welded shut. The window above the stairwell has been boarded over. Most people who pass by the building now probably don't notice anything unusual. But sometimes, when I think back to those final nights, I remember the sound I heard. The gentle turning of something mechanical, slow and steady, like a film reel gliding through a projector long after the credits had finished. And I wonder how long it had been running before someone finally opened the door. I had gone to the theater alone that night, as I usually did. It wasn't the kind of place most people stumbled into by accident. Tucked behind a strip of rundown storefronts, the building looked more like an abandoned warehouse than a functioning cinema. The paint on the walls had long since faded. The neon sign buzzed faintly even during the day, and the windows remained covered with warped, yellowing posters from films that had come and gone years ago. But for those of us who knew about it, the place had a certain draw. They ran films no one else did. Unrestored horror prints, lost reels from forgotten foreign directors, and odd little art house experiments that had never made it past their first screenings. That night in 2013, the film on the bill was one I'd never heard of. The flyer didn't offer much. Just a grainy image of a dim hallway and a line that read something like, "Restored from original European archive. One night only." There were no cast names, no synopsis, no production year. It didn't matter. For regulars like me, the more obscure, the better. The auditorium was more crowded than usual. I counted maybe 50 or 60 people scattered throughout the seats. Some were already talking in hushed voices as the lights dimmed. The opening moments of the film played in near total silence. There was no music, only the sound of a woman's slow footsteps echoing through a house. She walked from room to room, opening doors, glancing behind her, pausing in front of windows that revealed nothing but darkness. The camera didn't cut for long stretches. The woman didn't speak. There was a heaviness to the atmosphere, like the movie had been made not to entertain, but to trap its audience in a kind of suspended tension. After about 20 minutes, people started shifting in their seats. I thought it was just restlessness at first, the usual impatience when a film refuses to get to the point. But then someone a few rows ahead of me stood up without saying anything and walked out. A minute later, another person followed. It didn't feel disruptive, if anything. It felt like they were trying to leave without being noticed. By the time a third person exited, the discomfort in the room had grown heavier, though no one said a word about it. I stayed seated, trying to understand what was making everyone so uneasy. That was when I started noticing brief flashes in the footage. They didn't last long, barely a fraction of a second, but they looked completely out of place. The film itself had a muted, color-drained palette, but these inserted frames were in harsh black and white. They looked much older, more damaged. One showed a man's face staring directly into the lens, expressionless and pale. Another looked like a medical room of some kind, lit harshly with overhead lamps with what appeared to be blood on the walls. At first, I thought the projector was malfunctioning, but it kept happening. The main film would continue on with its slow, surreal pacing. and then one of those strange foreign images would flash between scenes. Each one felt more intrusive than the last. The audience had gone completely silent by then. Even the sounds of people breathing and shifting in their chairs had diminished, as if everyone was holding themselves still out of instinct. A woman sitting near the front suddenly stood up, clutching the armrest beside her. She let out a loud, ragged scream and stumbled toward the aisle, nearly tripping over her bag. She was crying and shaking, and when one of the theater staff approached her, she backed away from him, pressing herself against the wall like she was trying to get as far from the screen as possible. She kept repeating that someone had whispered her name. She said she felt breath against her ear. According to the usher, the seat beside her had been empty all night. Shortly after that, the screen froze. The film hung on a single frame, something I couldn't make out clearly, though I thought I saw part of a face in it. Then the image flickered and vanished. The projector shut off, and the house lights rose halfway. Leon, the projectionist and acting manager, stepped out from behind the curtain. He had been working at the theater for nearly a decade. People who came often knew his face, though he didn't talk much. He looked pale under the lights, like he hadn't slept in days. He explained that there had been a problem with the reel and apologized for the interruption. He offered refunds or passes for another screening. Most people left without complaint. They didn't seem angry, just eager to get out of the building. I lingered in the aisle for a few minutes. My head felt strange, like it was stuffed with cotton. There was a pressure behind my eyes that hadn't been there when I arrived. I looked back once at the dark screen and then followed the others out. The next day, I returned to ask about the film. Leon wasn't there. One of the staff said he hadn't come in for his shift and wasn't answering messages. That in itself was unusual, since Leon had a reputation for being meticulous, even obsessive, about the films they screened. When I came back a few days later, I was told he had resigned. No phone call, no explanation, just an email asking for his final paycheck to be mailed to his apartment. A co-worker who tried to visit him said Leon wouldn't come to the door. He spoke through the peephole only once, saying he'd watch the entire reel again after the audience had left. He had gone through it frame by frame, and that was all he said. The theater returned the reel to the distributor, who denied that any edits or splices had been made. They insisted it was an untouched archival copy sent directly from a European archive. The flashes of black and white footage we had seen, the grotesque imagery, the unnatural stillness of the faces, the unplaceable sense of wrongness, were not part of their original materials. They suggested someone on the theater staff had tampered with it, though no one else had access to the editing equipment, and the projection booth had been locked. After the incident, the theater announced it would no longer be holding midnight screenings. The old 35mm equipment was removed a few months later and replaced with digital projectors. Management never acknowledged what had happened, and no further comment was given to those who asked. The film was never shown again. It disappeared just as quickly as it had arrived. I have searched for that movie since then, hoping to find some mention of it online or in collectors' forums. No results ever lead back to it. The name on the flyer, if it was even the real title, seems to have left no trace. No one else has reported screening it, and no physical copies appear to exist. What stays with me most is not the content of the film itself, but the way the inserted images made me feel. They didn't seem like scenes from another movie. They felt like fragments of something much more personal, something not meant to be witnessed in public. They appeared without warning and left a residue that I still find difficult to explain. The faces in those flashes didn't move. They didn't act. They simply stared. And their stillness was more disturbing than any special effect or cinematic trick I had seen before. There are moments now, usually late at night, when I remember one of those faces. The pale, expressionless features, the half-lit eyes, the faint suggestion of blood beneath the skin. I never saw that film again. I never found Leon, and I never returned to that theater. But I still think about what was hidden inside that reel. Images that didn't belong, stitched into the movie like infections spreading through a body. Not part of the story, not part of the narrative. Just fragments. Real, or made to look real, but left there for a reason that none of us understood. I do not know who inserted them or why, but I believe that whoever did wanted them seen. Not all at once, not in sequence. Just enough to stay buried inside the viewer long after the film ended.